Y'all saw class? Guess we saw. Make sure. Before I like show up to class, nobody's there. Yeah, I really don't like.
I don't think anyone would be there to like witness it, so.
Echo 360 would. Echo 360 would see me walk in and walk out. Dude, Lily, you can come help paint too. We can have a whole paint party in there. I said, you can come help paint too. We can have a whole paint party. We had to patch the a million holes that Doug put in the walls when he had the office. And they're, I know, they're all like little, well, for the most part, they're all like the little, like, what are they called? Like a really small nails called. It's like, yeah, they're all like little things, but it's like all the way up the wall, all the way up the side, all the way down, like everywhere, because he hung stuff everywhere. It's called, no, it's called Midnight Blue. It's like a really dark blue, gray. It was real mysterious. Yeah. All right, let's get class started. This morning, we're gonna do Mission Connect. So I'm gonna get the papers for you, and what I'd rather you do is, if you have participated in the past, which is where we go and we sit with people you wouldn't usually sit with and get to know them, typically older folks who may not have as many people to talk to, and so you get to serve and you both are benefited. Some of that, I actually hear a lot of good stuff from older people who, I don't know if it always gets to you, but it always gets to me, where people say we really appreciate, that happening and stuff, and I'm like, well, it's the students who ended it, so, thank them. So anyways, so the church, like the people who you sit with actually really enjoy that, and appreciate the effort. So if there's been anybody last semester that you really enjoyed sitting with or getting to talk to or whatever, if you want to go sit with them again, then use this morning to go and do that. And if you want to participate but you don't know who to go sit with, let us know. We can go help you with that. This evening, our house will not be open, but it will be open for tomorrow night for the national championship. And Isabella is going to make lots of dips. And so some of them not dessert-like dips, and some of them dessert-like dips. And I don't know a better way to put that. But she went on Pinterest yesterday and found a whole bunch of dips. And so, anyways, so that'll be tomorrow night. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. So, now look, because 1 Corinthians is a really big book, we're going to have some classes where we got to cover a lot of ground. Will it happen? Probably not. But that's the goal. And because I really want to get toward where it gets more practical about the church issues and maybe some things that we would have more questions about. This is something that I think we can get through pretty quickly, hopefully, and then get into content where we may have some more questions and have to dig a little bit more later on and have time for that. So the first few classes, I think until we get to about chapter 7, we're going to be trying to cover a lot of ground. So we're going to start in chapter 1, verse 10, and go through chapter 2, verse 16. Now, just, I guess, a quick preface before we get into it. Paul is now addressing, like, some main problems. Before this, it was like, hey, I'm Paul, Sosthenes is here with me, you're Corinth, you're the saints in Corinth, or to the church in Corinth, and I thank God that He has worked in our lives for salvation, and the focus was on God. Now remember that, because he's going to come back to that idea. That was in verses 4 through 9, with that prayer that we studied, or the Thanksgiving. So now we get into verse 10, and he's going to hit on the first main problem. And I think it's interesting is that this is the first one he decides to talk about. There's a number of problems, a number of questions that they have. This is the first thing he gets at. I don't think that this was a question that they had, actually. There's a little bit later on, he's going to be like, hey, you sent me a letter with some questions. Let's start addressing them. This doesn't seem to be a question. This seems to be like a diagnostic. Like Paul says, this is a problem. And so before we even get to your questions, we need to address this. So this is important because he starts the letter with it. So let's start in verse 10. And someone read verses 10 through 13, please.
Now I exhort you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be made complete in the same mind and in the same judgment. For I have been informed concerning you, my brother, by Chloe's parents, that there are quarrels among you. Now I mean this, that each one of you is saying, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, and I am of Cephas, and I of Christ. Has Christ been divided? Paul was not crucified for you, was he? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul?
Okay. So Paul has this like formula. Verse 10 is kind of going to be like the thesis statement for the rest of this section. This is like the main issue. Remember, a thesis statement is like, this is all the stuff I'm about to talk about and how I'm going to do it. And so he kind of goes about it like that. Now, Jade, I was looking at you, but I'm not going to ask you any more English questions because last time.
This one I know.
Okay, I'll get you one. Next time I feel really confident, then maybe I'll get you. Okay, and so he says, this is like a formula he uses. He does this a couple times where he's got an address, and then he'll talk about the authority by which he's about to say these things, and then he's going to give you kind of a positive command. And sometimes, what I mean by positive command is he's not saying, hey, don't be divided, even though, I mean, he is saying that, but he says, instead, you all need to agree, which is a positive command. And so he says, I exhort you, brethren, this is a family situation here, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So this is not just a request. Your translation may say request, I request to you. This is not just a request, it is a command by Jesus, from the authority of Jesus, that you all agree. There be no divisions among you, but that you all be made complete in the same mind and in the same judgment. The problem is divisions, and the word that is divisions, like in the Greek, is where we get our word schism, which I think, to me at least, helped me have a little bit better of an idea, because we use divisions a lot. But schism is like, in my mind, I think about just two completely different bodies. I really think of like, you know, like when an earthquake happens, and then sometimes the land may like split a little bit, then there's like a big divide in between two huge pieces of land, a schism. Maybe that doesn't help you at all, but it helps at least give me an image of what we're talking about here, which is like there is a gap between this body and that body, but within the same body. And that's what Paul is getting at, that kind of irony. So he says, I want you to be made complete and in the same mind, in the same judgment. This word made complete, your translation may say knit together, maybe not, but that's kind of another way you can put it. In Mark 1 verse 19, the same word is used to talk about mending nets or restoring nets, so like you're tying them back together. But we get the same concept, I think, in Philippians 2. And we'll probably reference Philippians 2 a couple of times because this really sounds like that. You know, Philippians 2, like verses 1 through 4, where it says like, you know, make my joy complete by being of the same mind and being of the same spirit, united in spirit, and so on and so forth. The goal is, like in Philippians 2, there was division, and he says, make my joy complete by being of the same mind. Now, he uses really similar words here. He says, I want you to be made complete by having the same mind and being the same. You are such a legend, dude. Oh my goodness, I didn't even ask. No, it's just a goat. Dude, you're slowly climbing the Rebels board. You just jumped Nick, just with that move. All right. So this is important, and let me ask this question. So he hits at Philippians 2, and Paul says, make my joy complete, showing like how much Paul values unity in the church, how much he hates division, and maybe that's why he starts the letter with division here in 1 Corinthians, because he notices like this is a big deal, and I hate when Christ's body is divided. And so let's address this right off the bat. And so we kind of see that in Philippians 2 how much he cares about it, but I think it's worth asking. And you probably have the answer immediately, but we need to say it out loud. In what mind and judgment should they be conforming to? Like, whose mind and whose judgment should be conformed? Because if everybody's minds or opinions will inevitably differ, then what or who is the model? Does that make sense? So, who is it? Whose mind are we looking like?
Christ.
Okay, Christ. I know that was a kind of elementary question maybe, but I think it's worth talking about just for a second, because the same mind and same judgment is not my mind, nor is it yours. And that is why this is important to talk about, is because it's not any prominent members' minds, it's not even an elder's or deacon's minds, it is the mind of Christ that we all are to have, and that we all are to conform to. Like, this is not a, you're not looking at someone like popular or powerful or prominent in the church and saying, I want to be like that mind. It may be that you can use that person as an example, but the goal is that we all have Christ's mind. We are all conforming, changing, molding to that, not to anybody else. And so this is how Paul takes the Corinthian church problems and gives gospel-centered solutions. Remember how we talked about that last week, like gospel-centered solutions. He'll take a practical problem and say, this is how it's fixed by the gospel. He says, this is how it's fixed. Have the mind of Christ, which is exactly the format that he does in Philippians 2. Remember, he gives this whole, make my joy complete by being of the like mind, have the same mind, and united in spirit, and all this stuff. And then he says, verse 5, have this mind in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who gives us the gospel. Like verses 6 through 11 tells us this is the gospel. Like this, he came to earth, and he emptied himself, and he died, and he rose again, and now he's exalted to the right hand of God. Like, the gospel is the solution. And so he says in Philippians 2, 5 through 11, and I think it's implied here, and he's going to tell us explicitly later, Jesus possessed the mind that we all conform to. We're not submitting to the most powerful or smartest member, we're submitting to Christ. And so that's important because of verse 11. And we'll go faster through the rest of this, but this, because that was like the thesis statement, we really need to stick on it. Because of verse 11, where he says, I've been informed concerning you by Chloe's people, not his parents, by her parents. Yeah. Well, David immediately looked up and I was like, no, it's not a translation thing. By Chloe's people, that there are quarrels. And so obviously, there's some divisions here, and what's it about? Some of you are saying, I'm with Paul, I'm with Apollos, I'm with Cephas, I'm with Christ. So you're dividing over people. So there's divisions over who you're going to follow. And so that's why he goes ahead and says, you need to have the same mind and the same judgment. Later on, he's going to tell us this, but we know that judgment is not Cephas's or Paul's or Apollos's. It's Jesus's. So let's go through just a couple of these things, and then we'll stick on the main idea. Yes, go ahead.
It's about the most progressive thing you can think of. Because you're bringing in slave and master and man and woman and foreigner and going, you've all got to be of the same mind, which there's no other way you could except through me.
Yeah, that's a really good point, even especially with the audience that you're writing to, like you mentioned. Like, you got a variety of people here in this church, and He's saying you all have to be of the same mind. It doesn't matter your background or your culture or what you may prioritize or whatever. You all have the same mind now. And so that is a bold, maybe something that we gloss over. So I appreciate you bringing that out, just because that is a pretty bold thing to ask, but it is a command. Yeah.
Can you explain Mark 1:19?
Mark 1:19. Is the word not like mending nets?
Mending nets?
Yeah, I talked about it. There should be a word in there where they talk about mending nets. And it's the same word. Or something along the lines of mending.
I just missed it.
Okay. So I looked at the screen really skeptically for like 2 straight minutes.
I was just trying to
Because
figure it out. and I
Okay.
couldn't figure it out.
Alright, anyways, back to Chloe's people. Alright, so Chloe, now look, we don't really know a lot about Chloe or her people, and so we're doing a little bit of speculation here. But Chloe, the word Chloe is not like just a normal name necessarily, like a proper name. It's also a word or adjective that could describe slaves. And so we could be talking about here a freed woman, like she was a slave, now she's free, who became a wealthy businesswoman somehow. That's totally possible. Or her name's just Chloe, I guess. But that word itself means that, and so some people think, okay, well, she's a slave who's now free. Many people think that she is from Ephesus, and that her workers would travel to Corinth, from Ephesus to Corinth for business. Because it says that, and we can kind of imply that at least some of her workers, the ones talking to Paul, are Christians, right? Because they are talking to Paul, recognizing that there's divisions in the church in Corinth, and giving Paul a report of that. Okay, so it's worth noting. Keep in mind, Paul's not writing this from Corinth. He's somewhere else. Though we don't really know about Chloe, if Chloe's a Christian or not. Maybe she is, but regardless, the witness, like the name Chloe's people, carries some weight within the Corinthian church. They recognize who that is, or Paul would have said it like it. And so they obviously know who Paul is talking about. And if Paul had used those people in Corinth, I thought this was interesting, like when I read this, if Paul had used people in Corinth who had maybe, like, in chapter 16, you're going to see that there were some people who came and visited Paul, like Stephanus and Crispus Gaius, or something like that. Maybe not Crispus Gaius, but there were some people who came and delivered the letter to Paul that he's addressing, you know. And if he had said, those people told me that there's some quarrels among you, then it would have been like even more emphasizing like prominent leaders and all this kind of stuff. And so Paul's not even referencing any of them. He's referencing some people who probably aren't even from Corinth. They just saw it and gave him a report and said, there's some quarrels among you, I hear. And so he's going to address these from people who aren't even at the church in Corinth, who just saw, hey, there's some divisions in that church. And when they came back, they reported Paul. So, who are the leaders we're dividing over? Now, keep in mind that Paul's not actually like saying that all of these people are at fault in their ministry as leaders, but that the church is being so loyal to them, it appears, that they're quarreling over it. So we've got Paul, who established the church in Corinth. We've got Apollos, who's known as an eloquent, knowledgeable speaker. He's from the school of Alexandria. He's a Jewish man, and he was converted by Aquila and Priscilla in Acts chapter 18. That happened in Corinth, and so we know that Apollos is in Corinth when he's converted. And like I said, he went to the school of Alexandria. Now, this is a big deal school. He would have trained under some big deal, knowledgeable people. And because of who he was trained under, it's possible that maybe some people in Corinth, in their search for worldly wisdom, would have seen Apollos. We're going to get to that whole worldly wisdom idea in a second. Would have seen Apollos and been like, hey, this guy is pretty intelligent. He's pretty smart. He's got lots of wisdom. We prefer him. But then you got Cephas, which is just Aramaic for what we would call Peter. And so this Peter we're talking about. We don't really know Peter's affiliation here. We don't really know how much impact he had on the church of Corinth. Not sure. But obviously he was somehow present, at least if nothing else, an impact. And then we have Jesus, Christ. And since Paul is including Jesus in a list of divisions, I think there's a couple of options here. It's possible that there is a group who is using the name of Jesus, either maybe in an elitist way or in another way, and using it divisively. And so in this way, they would have maybe the correct words, I am of Christ, but they've got the wrong mentality. Okay? So it's possible, and I just think that because it's in a list of, he's saying like, this is the problem. some of you are saying this. So it's possible that this is somehow, they're using it incorrectly. They have a wrong mentality. It's also possible that this group is just the only ones who understand their identity. Yeah, I'm of Christ. And implied, the rest of you don't know what you're talking about. And so maybe these people are the ones who understand their identity as Christ followers. Now, I think it's worth noting that that there are a lot of people, at least what I read, that maybe don't think that this is literal camps here, but more so that Paul is just recognizing that there is division over people, maybe within the church in Corinth, and he doesn't want to name any names or whatever, but he's basically just pointing out how childish their division is. And so I thought that was interesting. If nothing else, I think we could take that idea that their division is childish and that Paul is trying to make that case, because in chapter 3, verse 1, he's going to talk about how childish they are, that they're infants spiritually and that they're immature. And so, if nothing else, I think that's there. Regardless, though, Paul makes this point that they've got the I disease, hyper-individualism. That's something that Cole actually mentioned last week in regard to our own culture. He repeats I a lot. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ. And he's kind of pointing out like how individual they see themselves and how childish this whole issue is. And so he asks this kind of rhetorical question, which actually could also be like an exclamation mark, which I thought is interesting because like the original, how they would have written would not have had like question marks and stuff. And so we just kind of had to put that in, assuming this is a question. But it could also be like an exclamation, like Christ's body is divided, or Christ is divided. And so either way, I thought it was interesting. But as a question, it kind of serves rhetorically to ask, like, are you telling me that there's only one group within the body of Christ who can have Christ? Like, is this what you're saying? And so Paul goes on to kind of say, like, I wasn't crucified for you, but you're following me. Like, you weren't baptized in the name of Paul. Like, he abhors this idea that he would be used in this way. So let's get to verse 14. I accidentally included something that I just got out. Anyways, it's not part of the Bible, just trust. So I'm going to read verses 14 through 19, and we'll continue through that thought.
Thank God that I baptized none of you except Cephas and Gaius, so that no one would say that you were baptized in my name. Now I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized any other, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not in cleverness of speech, so that the cross of Christ would not be made void. Redacted. For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside.
Okay, we got a few notes here that's worth addressing. The first one is, you got this guy named Crispus, who is mostly assumed, pretty positive, that he's found in Acts chapter 18. Remember, Paul's in Corinth. We've referenced Acts 18 a number of times now. In verse 8, we see that Crispus is the ruler of the synagogue in Corinth. And if I remember right, I think he also got like cast out and beat up. And so there might be a couple of them, maybe not. But anyway, so the ruler of the synagogue, it appears he was converted. Paul baptized him. We've also got Gaius, who's this man who, and when we look in Romans chapter 16, verse 23, he was hosting a gathering of Christians. And so he was using his house as a church. He's probably a Roman freedman. He was a slave, now he's not, who he made money in Corinth. He's kind of living the quote-unquote Corinthian dream in the fact that he was someone who wasn't really worth much and he was able to go and make some money. But he's using that now, it appears, as a means to benefit the church. And so we've got two people here converted by Paul. And we also see that Paul baptized Stephanas. And I think it's interesting that he says, like, man, I thank God that I only baptized Crispus and Gaius, so no one will say you were baptized in my name. Oh, I also baptized. And so it's kind of, it's almost like Paul is just speaking this this may not be how it is, but it seems that Paul's kind of like speaking this to Sosthenes, because Sosthenes is writing it, and Paul's like, oh, also. And then he jots it down too. Maybe not. But he says, now I also did baptize the whole household of Stephanas. And beyond that, I don't know if I baptized any other. And so it's almost like he went from, glad I only baptized you two. Oh, wait. No, okay, also Stephanas. Okay, actually, I don't even remember anymore. But, like, not that many of you, and that's the point. And so, anyways, I thought that was funny. Stephanus was the first converts in the province of Achaia, so like where Corinth is, that whole basically kind of like a state or whatever. And he seems to be a leader in the church here. So he's referenced again in chapter 16, verses 15 through 17. So we see Paul's like, I'm really not as concerned with doing the actual baptizing. In fact, I'm glad that I didn't, because let's see, where is it? Verse 17. For Christ didn't send me to baptize; He sent me to preach the gospel. So he recognized this is my mission. My mission is to declare the gospel, not just baptize a bunch of people, so I don't always have to be the one baptizing. In fact, it seems that he might be aware of the fact that some people could lift him up, as maybe how they're doing here in Corinth. And so maybe he's already thinking, it's better that I just don't. It's better that someone else does it, for members to do it, and I just do the declaring of the gospel, which I think is interesting if you compare that to maybe like, I don't know if you've ever heard preachers say like, well, they baptized over 1,000 people or whatever. I'm like, how did you count? Like, were you counting? Did you have a notebook? Like, how were you counting this many people? And so I used to hear numbers like that all the time, and I'd always think like, were you counting every time? Paul certainly wasn't. He doesn't even remember anymore. He's like the household, however many in Corinth. Well, that's not the point. So anyways, that was fine. Okay, verse 17. Now, he says, when he is preaching the gospel, it's not in cleverness of speech that the cross of Christ would not be made void. And initially, if you're like me at least, that sounds like how he was speaking. Like I wasn't really clever when I was speaking. But I think this is more so on the content of the gospel, on the content of what he was saying. And he's about to elaborate on that. But he says the gospel does not consist of, I think this is like wisdom of word. They translate it as cleverness of speech. But the speech is just the word. And so it's kind of like the wisdom of word. He says, no, there's another word that the gospel consists of. And he says, that the cross of Christ will not be made void. For the word of the cross is foolishness. So there's a different word here. Not cleverness of speech or wisdom of word or cleverness of word, whatever you want to say, but the word of the cross. So he's going to set these in contrast. Now let me ask this question. He says, I didn't preach the gospel, we're talking about the gospel here, I didn't preach it in cleverness of speech so that the cross of Christ would not be made void. Now, why choose to say the cross of Christ rather than just say the gospel? Like again, right? We're talking about the gospel. So I didn't come to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not in cleverness of speech so that the gospel would not be made void. He could say that, right? Because that's what we're talking about. But he says the cross of Christ. So why do you think he uses that phrase? What's the effect on the audience? Does anything change when you hear, if you were to read this as, so the gospel will not be made void, versus, so that the cross of Christ may not be made void? Is there a difference in how you read that?
Well, they kind of go back, like in the beginning, they're referencing all their like individualism, and then he's kind of bringing them like, this is why we're actually doing it, because Christ died on the cross.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an element of that where, like, they all are trying to, like you said, be like individual, and in a way, like that's prideful. It's pride that's really causing the issue here. But he's calling us back to the sacrifice of Jesus, to the cross, which is like the epitome of humility. It's like the worst punishment you could have, and it's embarrassing. And so the sacrifice of Jesus, he says, is wasted on those who put selves before or above the cause of the church. So the cross is just this image that should serve as like an antidote. It is completely opposite, but it should fix the problem. For pride and for self-glorification, it is completely opposite, but it should fix it. And so division cannot exist in a people whose focus is on the cross. And so I think that might be why he maybe changes the words a little bit and uses that phrase. If you always are reading with a why that phrase or why those words or whatever, you can get some interesting conclusions where I think maybe we get a little bit more out of this. Where he's trying to point us to the cross. And obviously the gospel has the same kind of effect or the same idea. We're talking about the same stuff. But the cross points us to an image where you cannot glorify self. You can't be prideful. Okay, let's get verse 18. he's going to start contrasting word of wisdom to word of the cross. They're contrast now. The cross is foolish to those people who are self-absorbed. Why would you ever subject yourself to that kind of sacrifice, the cross? But the cross is also the power by which God saves. Remember Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where he says that exactly, that the gospel is the power of Christ unto salvation, or the power of God unto salvation. And so I think it's Romans 1:16, I'm pretty sure. So he goes on, and in verse 19, he says, "For it is written," and he quotes this verse in Isaiah 29, verse 14. And in Isaiah 29, verse 14, you have these wise men of Judah who think, all right, hey, we're in pretty bad shape. Maybe it'd be better to form an alliance with Egypt. Maybe that would be wise. Even though God specifically said, never, ever turn back to Egypt. Never. Well, they think, hey, now this could be wise. And so their wisdom could be greater than God's. And so he's referencing this verse and says, like, to people who are self-glorifying, to people who are perishing, God's wisdom, the cross, is foolish. We're about to see how these are basically synonyms. But to us, it is our means of salvation. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. These people who think, yeah, let's go back to Egypt. And the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Let's keep going. Oh, forgot the arrow. So I'm going to read verses 20 through 25.
Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of the age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through his wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For indeed, Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men.
Okay, so Paul is going to call on all the wise ones, quote unquote, of the ancient world. All the people that the ancient world is going to see, like, hey, these are the top dogs of intellect and wisdom. So something that is sought after a lot, especially in Greek culture. Paul's going to call on all these people and say that the cross, which is God's saving act, makes the wisdom of man, even the people who are the top dogs, foolish. And it is not through man's wisdom, which Corinth is greatly seeking after. One really old, like 1st or 2nd century person said that on every street corner of Corinth, you can find a man who has the solution. Like, a man who considers himself wise. Everybody in Corinth is seeking after wisdom here. And he says it's not through man's wisdom that God ever became known, but it's by the foolishness of the message, which is the cross, that people became known. Now, let me ask this. Why would Paul call God's message foolish? What do you think the point is? What's the effect? Like, what's he trying to do? See that in verse 21. Presents in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God. God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. Why would he call the message foolish? Let's start here. Is he being literal? Is the message actually foolish? No. Okay? And so there's got to be a point here. What would be the point? You've got an audience, well, not an audience, you've got a world who sees the cross as foolish. So he's kind of playing on this idea, like in his contrast between you got wisdom of the world, which everybody's really seeking after, and the cross, which nobody wants. Paul says that God is well pleased by the very message that the world calls foolish, the cross. The world sees the cross and thinks it's foolish. We're putting that aside. It's ridiculous. And that is what God used to save the world, all of those who believe. And so in verse 22, he says, indeed, Jews ask for signs, Yeah, we get that in Matthew 11, verse 30 and 39, where they're asking Jesus for a sign. And Jesus says, like, yeah, you always want signs. Like, I know how this goes. I'm not doing it. I've already given you miracles. You've already seen them. And Greeks, they're always searching for wisdom, especially these Greek philosophers, is something they always seek after. The Jews believed that they had God completely figured out. So if you're going to change my mind, then you're going to have to show me a sign. And the Greeks believed that God was considered ultimate reason, but it was only based on what they found to be reasonable. Like, God, yeah, sure, he's the ultimate source of reason, but if it's outside of my own, reason, if it doesn't seem reasonable to me, it must not be God. And yet wisdom is found in the cross, what both parties would see as unreasonable and ridiculous, and not at all a sign. In fact, it would be the death of the movement of Jesus for the Jews, is the cross, and it's the wisdom of the cross that God saves. It is in the cross where wisdom exists. Neither party wants to accept that, neither the Jews or the Greeks. But to those who have been affected or saved by the cross of Christ, they recognize it is God's wisdom. It is how he affected the world. It is God's plan. And so he says, we preach Christ crucified. That's all Paul came to do, right? We already talked about that. To Jews, a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles is foolish. But to those who are the called, which is a term we get a lot, we've already seen it a couple times, both the Jews and the Greeks, it's available to everybody. Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Christ is, he says, we preach Christ crucified. Christ is the power of God, and he is the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men. The weakness of God is stronger than men. He's not saying like, well, the dumbest parts of God are even better than the smartest parts of man. Even though that may be like originally or initially how you read it. Me too. He's more so saying, maybe that's true, I don't know. But he's more so saying that wisdom will never be found in man's intellect. It is only in what man considers foolish, which is the cross, where wisdom is found. So, it's in verses 26 through 31. I'll just read this quickly. For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. So he's saying, like, not a lot of you were known as super intelligent or wise, nor very powerful or prominent, nor from wealthy or prominent families. You were all kind of the bottom of the pack here. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised. God has chosen the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that man may not boast before God. So that no man may boast before God. So let's stop there for a second. What he says is, the world would have considered you foolish, all of you. And yet, God used the foolish things, which we've already said is the cross, right? But also, he seems to be pointing to the church. And says God's used the church, and he's used the cross to shame the wise. And he says he's chosen the weak things to shame the things that are strong. And the base things, and the despised things, God's chosen. The things that are not, he's chosen to nullify or to get rid of the things that are present and that people do lift up and consider to be wise. He uses the cross and the lowly Corinthian church to enact his plan of salvation and to spread that to the world. So it's those who partake in the foolishness of the cross who are saved in the future. But he says these things that are, the things that are in the present, well, they're going to be nullified. They're going to be put away. They're going to be gotten rid of. It's temporary, the things that are currently. But God uses the things which currently nobody cares about and puts away and considers foolish to enact his plan, to shame the wise and to put down the strong. So he says in verse 30, and the whole point is this, by the way, so no man may boast before God. Remember when we talked about the prayer, and we were like, wow, like how can these people be considered blameless? And it's because of God, and everything that Paul has been pointing to so far has been what God has done in the church, so that no man may boast before God. It's God that is doing the work, the action. So verse 30, but by his doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God. Christ became wisdom from God, and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So that just as is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. So Paul gives us a really easy code for the rest of like chapter 2 and stuff, which is Christ became wisdom. Anytime we see wisdom, we're going to be thinking about Christ, not some kind of like lofty, like, I don't know, wise. we're talking about Christ here. And it's Christ who became wisdom for us. And he changed our status completely before God. He makes us holy, and we've gone from slaves to free. He just completely changed our status. Just as written, let him who boasts in the Lord, because it's God who did the work. This is God that we're talking about. And he uses Jeremiah 9 to show that. So we probably won't get through all this, but let's keep going into chapter 2. He says, and when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God, for I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ, and him crucified, what we've already talked about. I was with you in weakness and fear and in much trembling. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Now he's going to talk about his preaching. He said, hey, I didn't come to you like all these other guys, the actual foolish people who come and try to persuade you with their words. I don't have to do that. I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and crucified. In chapter 15, he's going to maybe clarify what he means by this. He's going to say, this is the primary stuff. This is what I came to you with. The fact that Jesus came to this earth, died, and rose again. And then that whole section, that whole chapter is on the resurrection. He says, this is all I talked about. I was with you in weakness, which could be he was sick, or it could be what he founds his ministry on, which is that he is weak. Or in fear, where we kind of get God in Acts 18, verses 9 through 11, maybe comforting and motivating Paul, where Paul's in Corinth, and he's just seen a bunch of people get beaten up, and God's like, no, you stay and work this out. And he says, my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom. It's not in all this stuff like you've been hearing, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power. God has shown you the effect of the gospel. Like, you know true wisdom and the effectiveness of the gospel because of the Spirit that's worked in the church here. It's God who's shown that. So that your faith would not rest on me and my words, but on God. And so they shorted us, so we're going to keep going. It says, yet we do speak wisdom among those who are mature. A wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of the age who are passing away, but we speak God's wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God predestined before the ages of our glory. The wisdom which none of the rulers of this age has understood, for if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But just as is written, things which eye has not seen and ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love him. He says, we're not speaking this wisdom to those who are mature, or considered mature, and he's going to talk about that a little bit more. He says a wisdom, however, he says that we do speak wisdom among those who are mature, but he says this is a wisdom that's not of this age. He's redefining wisdom. You would know it as like the Greek philosophers and all this smart guy stuff. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a wisdom that is above what you may know of this age. And he says we speak God's wisdom in a mystery. And this is kind of confusing, but we've already kind of got the code cracked for us earlier. We speak God's wisdom. Who's God's wisdom? It's Jesus, right? He became God's wisdom. We speak God's wisdom in a mystery. Well, Jesus says that. He says, this is why I speak in parables, because it's supposed to be a mystery and people are supposed to figure it out. He says, we speak God's wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom, Jesus, which God predestined before the ages of our glory. Well, this was the plan the whole time. God had planned for Jesus to come the whole time. We see that in these scriptures in Ephesians 1 and 2 Timothy 1, verse 9. That this was always God's plan for Jesus, his wisdom, to come. But man would not know God's wisdom and God's plan, or God at all, if it weren't for that, for the mystery, for the hidden wisdom, Jesus coming to earth. And they said the wisdom, which nobody cared about, nobody understood, and if they had understood it, they wouldn't have killed the wisdom, the Son of Glory, just as written. And he uses these verses from Isaiah. So, we're about to close. To us, God revealed them through the Spirit, God's wisdom. He revealed it through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so, the thoughts of God, no one knows except the Spirit of God. So, quickly he says, the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God. And this is not like the Spirit is sitting in the library of God, flipping through pages to make sure he knows everything. He's trying to make a point. And so he's saying, hey, the Spirit knows even the deepest parts of God. Anything that you would want to know, the Spirit knows about God. And then he makes this, kind of asks this question, like, I'm never going to know
Davis is thinking. Davis is never going to know what I'm thinking because only his spirit would know, and only my spirit would know. And then he uses that to make this point. Even so, the thoughts of God, nobody knows except the Spirit of God, because he's God. And now we have received, not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit, who is from God. And so he's saying, like, you really want to know about God? He offers his Spirit. He's going to show you everything you need to know. So that we may know the things freely given to us by God. You want to know true wisdom? Okay, well, you need to be God's people. He offers his Spirit so that you can know true wisdom. And it is only by his Spirit that you can ever know it. That's what he's getting at here. Which things we also speak, Jesus, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit. Combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words, which is even a hard phrase to translate. It's kind of a weird phrase. But essentially he's saying the things which the Spirit teaches us, we also teach. And it is of the Spirit. Those words are of the Spirit. This is the last verse. He says, but a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. They are foolishness to him. And he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised or judged or discerned. But he who is spiritual appraises all things. Yet he himself is appraised by no one. For who has known the mind of the Lord, that he will instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Okay, hey, that's closing up what we talked about earlier, right? But whose mind do we have? Well, Paul's going to give us the answer here. We all have the mind of Christ. And I think this ties us back into our thesis statement there at the beginning. And the point he's making is the natural man is the carnal one, the one who is of the world. He thinks the cross is foolish, so he'll never accept the Spirit of God. He can never understand spiritual things because they are only judged spiritually. But he who is spiritual, who has the Spirit, judges all things, the things that are good and things that are evil or of the world. And he himself is appraised by no one. The world's never going to understand him. Will never understand that which is spiritual, including the spiritual man, the one who has the Spirit. For, and he's going to turn this to God, who has known the mind of the Lord, that he will instruct him? Well, nobody knows the mind of God, right? None of us can know the mind of God, but because God sent his Spirit, we can. And so because God has sent his Spirit to the church, to God's people, we can have the mind of Christ. And so it loops us back to where we started in chapter 1, verse 10. I know that's fast. Fun fact, this word is only used in 1 Corinthians, and most people think it's a word from Corinth, and that Paul is like using a Corinthian word to kind of out them, ironically. So I thought that was interesting. All right. I had to get that out. All right, I think that's all. Sorry we went over, but I really didn't want to have to come back here for next class. And so I want to know if you have any questions or need notes or something like that. I'm going to do it right now.
Can't say that.
So valid. It was tacos, though. Most of the time, if I ever ask someone what I'm thinking right now, it's tacos.
Why don't you say tacos when you could say, what are you gonna try and do with a burrito? What are you overriding of these?
Because for years, it's always been tacos. Like, whenever I ask that question, the answer is always tacos. So next time that happens,
Just remember that word.
tacos, and then you can look really cool.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Nick kicked it like 3 years ago.
Rebel?
No, when? I think he was wrestling someone,
It's like a sensor.
and then kicked it on
Because
accident.
like they came with maintenance and changed the batteries and
What,
break. Then
So
it
it could be
went
gone.
off twice.
I know, I didn't know.
And so
That-
they're like,
Well, you had to do the leg work in chapter 1 so you could go chapter 2 fast. Even though I probably went too fast, but that pretty much was all that I had for it, so.
what? It like started getting